On February 1st, 1960, four college freshmen sat down at the Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Little did they know that they would start a huge revolution by re-energizing the struggle for civil rights. The 1960s brought forth a decade of public activism and an ongoing conflict with the Soviet Union that threatened the domestic security of the United States. The decade, full of fear and activism, defined American society during the 1960s and uplifted the United States to where we are today.
Seven months before Kennedy's campaign, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was created in order to help coordinate sit-in movements, and were led by inspirational individuals such as Martin Luther King Jr. These members were committed to nonviolence and would risk their lives in a constant struggle for social justice and equality. The decade opened with a blast. In 1960, the people of America turned to a brand new candidate, John F. Kennedy. Kennedy's rhetoric and style captured the attention of many Americans. As a senator, he endorsed the Cold War policy of containment. He enjoyed a landslide re-election to the Senate in 1958, which helped build an image that he was a strong and healthy man. On the contrary, he was also diagnosed with a disease that was thought to be terminal.
During the campaign, Kennedy reached mixed success in the South, but he was strongly supported in the Northeast and the Midwest. His Roman Catholic faith hurt him in some states, where many thought that he would take direction from the Pope, but it helped him in states with large Catholic populations. During his campaign, he gave top priority to waging the Cold War, and he excluded confidence that would win the war. He criticized Eisenhower's foreign policy during his campaign, using words such as unimaginative by accusing him of missing opportunities to reduce the threat of nuclear war and of weakening the U.S. standing. His election victory against the Republican counterpart, Richard Nixon, was very slim. He won with a margin of 119,000 votes out of a total of about 70 million votes.
Kennedy was the first president to be born in the 20th century. As president, he surrounded himself with mostly young advisors or intellectual verve, who proclaimed that they had fresh ideas for invigorating the nation. Some of these included Robert McNamara, age 44, Secretary of Defense. He graduated from Harvard at age 24 and had been an assistant professor at Harvard and the Whiz Kid president of the Ford Motor Company. McGeorge Bundy, age 41, Special Assistant of National Affairs to Kennedy. He became a Harvard Dean at age 44 with a bachelor degree. Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, 52. He was a Rhodes Scholar in his youth. And finally, Robert Kennedy, age 44, brother of Kennedy and Attorney General.
It is no surprise that the best and brightest operated on the subject of foreign policy. One of Kennedy's top priorities was waging the Cold War. In his inaugural address, he stated, "Let every nation know that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assist in the survival and success of liberty."
Just 1 month after Kennedy's youthful administration had been set up, thousands of SNCC volunteers, most of which were college and high school students, risked their lives walking the dangerous backroads of Mississippi and Georgia. They motivated African Americans to register and vote. Volunteers came from different locations and backgrounds, but the majority were Southern African Americans. However, a few volunteers were from the North and of white skin color. These individuals understood the hardships faced by many African Americans on a day-to-day basis and saw firsthand how powerlessness and poverty intersected their lives.
On a more positive note, in Kennedy's foreign policy, he came to understand that there was a limit to American influence abroad and showed this through his cautiousness in his foreign policy. He proved willing to talk to the Soviets, but also sought a victory in the Cold War. The Kennedy administration then went out to help developing nations through the early stages of nationhood with aid programs aimed at improving agriculture, transportation, and communication. This could only be done with his multi-billion-dollar Alliance for Progress, which spurred economic progress in Latin America. This program was only partially successful though. Infant mortality rates improved, but Latin American economies registered not too impressive growth rates. Also, class divisions here continued to widen, exacerbating political unrest. Also, in the same year, he created the Peace Corps, which dispatched thousands of American teachers, agricultural specialists, and health workers, many out of college, to assist those in developing countries. The Peace Corps embodied both the idealistic can-do spirit of the 1960s and Americans' long pursuit of moral leadership in the world.
In addition to these programs, the administration also relied on the more insidious concept of counterinsurgency to defeat revolutionaries who challenged pro-American Third World governments. In addition, the American military trained native and police forces to quell unrest. Although many foreign countries welcomed U.S. economic assistance and craved American material culture, they resented interference by outsiders. And because aid was usually transmitted by a self-interested elite, it often failed to reach the poor.
Just 1 month after the Alliance of Progress and Peace Corps were deemed ineffective, Kennedy approved a plan that would once and for all overthrow the Castro government put in place in Cuba. CIA-trained Cuban exiles would land and secure a beachhead, and the Cuban people would rise up against the Castro regime. Kennedy approved of the plan, and 1,200 Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. Unfortunately, no Cubans were there in order to help overthrow the Castro government, and the invaders quickly found themselves surrounded and captured. In order to keep the operation hidden, he refused to provide air attacks, but the CIA invasion quickly became public. Castro knew the United States would never accept defeat and would eventually launch another invasion. He looked towards the Soviet Union for continued economic and military aid.
While the United States faced problems in Cuba, the civil rights movement was gaining major ground at home. 13 members of the Congress of Racial Equality, a non-violent organization which purchased bus tickets for a 1,500-mile road trip across the South. This racially integrated group would be known as the Freedom Riders. They wanted to demonstrate that despite desegregation orders around the country, strict Jim Crow laws still played a major role in the South. Some suffered injuries that they would never recover from along the journey, and thousands barely escaped brutal attacks. President Kennedy, in most cases, was reluctant to act, but the international outcry in some instances forced him to. In Alabama, Kennedy sent federal marshals in order to protect Freedom Riders and their supporters, but in other instances, allowed them to be arrested.
Other international problems arose during 1961, including those with the Soviet Union. On June 3rd, Nikita Khrushchev met with optimistic Kennedy in order to discuss preconditions for peace and stability in the world. Unfortunately, the two leaders were unable to come to an agreement over the arms race and peace throughout the world. The United States wanted the Soviet Union to stop testing nuclear weapons, but because of the disagreements that arose, the two nations accelerated their arms race even further. The problem got so out of hand that President Kennedy advised citizens to build fallout shelters in their backyard.
Sadly, the conflict with Cuba raged on all the way through the end of 1961, where President Kennedy launched Operation Mongoose in order to disrupt the island's trade, support raids from Cuba to Miami, and plot to kill Castro. The plans to kill Castro were intricately planned out, such as lacing his cigars with explosives or even attempt to harpoon him while snorkeling on a Caribbean resort.
At the beginning of 1962, the United States was determined to be the first to send a man on the moon. The Soviets were already in the lead, and the United States was not happy. With billions of dollars in new funding, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA, began its Apollo program. In February of 1962, John Glenn orbited the Earth in space capsule Friendship 7.
During the spring of 1962, the issue with Cuba raged on to the point of war. Khrushchev believed an invasion was on its way, and he had aspirations that the presence of nuclear weapons would deter any sort of attack. However, this wasn't Khrushchev's only motive for deploying nuclear weapons. Instead, he thought it would benefit the Soviets' position in the nuclear balance of power. He also believed that it would force Kennedy to solve the German problem. All along, Khrushchev had been worried that the United States was providing West Berlin with nuclear weapons. And what better way to display presence and power than deploy missiles 90 miles off the coast of Florida?
Soviet Union had been deploying missiles in Cuba. Kennedy had been forced to act once again for the civil rights movement, but this time in order to help James Meredith, the first African American student to attend the University of Mississippi. Meredith had been attacked by white mobs, and in response, Kennedy ordered 500 U.S. Marshals in order to protect Meredith. The white mobs reacted by attacking the Marshals, even killing 2 and wounding 160, but regardless, this was a major step in the civil rights movement, especially since the federal government acted once again to protect the lives of African Americans.
1 month after Kennedy sprung into action, a U-2 spy plane was caught flying over Cuba, photographing missile sites. The president immediately organized a special executive committee of advisors to force nuclear warheads out of Cuba. Multiple options were discussed from completely different sides of the political spectrum, all the way from a full-out invasion to quiet diplomacy. B-52 bombers and warships began crossing over the Caribbean Sea, and many thought the United States was on the brink of war with the Soviet Union over the issue in Cuba. The Soviet Union replied, stating that the missiles would be removed if the United States pledged to never attack Cuba and if they removed Jupiter missiles aimed at the Soviet Union from Turkey. The United States came to an agreement 6 days later on October 28, 1962, stating that they promised never to attack Cuba and remove Jupiter missiles in exchange for the Soviet Union to remove missiles in Cuba. The Soviet Union agreed and the missiles were removed. Kennedy received a lot of backlash along with support from many Americans. Some stated that Kennedy had created the crisis in the first place and that quiet diplomacy would have had the same effect. Others stated that the president handled the situation spectacularly, with his calm attitude and informative command.
While Soviet Union problems were being fixed, certain Americans were still stubborn about their views towards racial equality, one example being George C. Wallace. He stated that the door would be barred shut to any African Americans in the University of Alabama. His most famous quotation, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever."
African Americans were not going to back down from their civil rights crusade and were fully aware that they would stir violent response. They elected the influential and well-known Martin Luther King Jr. as a leader who wanted to show the racist hate and violence that marred their country. Hundreds of African Americans were arrested until they launched a very controversial action. They put children, some as young as 6 years old, on the front lines of protest. The police commissioner, Eugene Bull, ordered his police to use water guns and dogs against them. The attacks horrified many Americans at home, and yet again, Kennedy was quick to act. He ordered white business and political elite to negotiate a compromise.
During the summer of 1963, from June 10 to June 12, Kennedy did several things that would change the world. On June 10th, Kennedy spoke on conciliatory terms at the University of America, urging cautious steps towards the step of disarmament with the Soviet Union. On June 11th, Kennedy committed the power of the federal government to order racial justice even over the opposition of individual states. The next evening, Kennedy told Americans it was time for the nation to fulfill its promise.
Just 1 month later, 250,000 Americans gathered on the Washington Mall to show their support for Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. Whites and blacks joined hands and sang in the words of the old Negro spirit, "Free at last." Television programs cut away from regular afternoon soap operas to broadcast one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous speeches. The March for Jobs and Freedom was another way for African Americans to secure justice and equality. However, just days later, white supremacists bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, killing 4 black girls.
As the fall of 1963 came around, many thought the Cold War was coming to an end, and that fears and troubles in American society would soon be over. However, in November, Kennedy visited Texas, the home state of his Vice President Lyndon Johnson. Riding with his wife in an open-top limousine, Kennedy was cheered on by thousands of Americans. All of a sudden, shots rang out. President Kennedy had been shot in the head. The same day, police captured their suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald, a former U.S. Marine. 2 days later, Oswald was shot dead by Jack Ruby. Many wondered why Ruby shot Oswald. Was it to hide the truth and prevent him from implicating others? It is still unknown today, but Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren stated that Oswald had acted alone.
Throughout and after Kennedy's presidency, a new and unique youth culture emerged with the help of music, new fashions, and attitudes about sex. A new style of music was introduced by bands like the Beatles, which electrified thousands of teenagers. This love for music spread throughout the nation and became the interest of many. Furthermore, an increasing number of white youth came to look and act in ways reflecting the growth of this youth culture. Coats, ties, stockings, and bras started to disappear from the day-to-day clothing for this generation of Americans. In addition, young men grew out their hair, resulting in complaints from parents. Moreover, the introduction of the birth control pill encouraged premarital sex, which no longer ruined a woman's reputation. This new culture created an alternative lifestyle referred to as counterculture, as it rivaled the pre-existing values of the middle class in the 1950s.